Okay, we're recording, and I guess I'm as ready as I'll ever be. It's a little bit late in this semester, but I really wanted to take a crack at telling this story. And I've been wanting to do this for a while. It's hard because I'm telling an historical story today, and there's a lot of information. So organizing the information in an organizing way was a challenge to spend this Saturday on, but I can now. Uh, do, I think, some kind of job anyway on this amazing story of Julius Caesar, Mark Antony, and Cleopatra. That's the story that I want to tell you today. It's a story that everybody should know just because of its entertainment value, I would say. But speaking as your humanities teacher and someone who's trying to get you familiar with ancient Rome, I would say two other things about it as well. Might as well step out for a sec again. I think there's sort of two things that came out of this project of trying to put together some kind of story about Julius Caesar, Mark Antony, and Cleopatra. And, and that is the first part, the first thing to take away is, look at the way these people at the top of sort of the food chain in Rome in the first century BCE, century leading up to the time of Christ. Look at the kinds of lives they led. We think it's pretty great, I guess, here in the beginning of the 21st century, where we take the president or the prime minister, or whoever. Let's think of the president of the United States in the 20th century, sort of jumping on their Air Force One and flying all around the world, flying off to Russia, the Secretary of State, flying off to Russia, flying off to Tokyo, and so on. And it's pretty impressive. But get this sense that these leaders of Rome at the time that we're looking at here, well, let's be precise, that is to say, people like Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, Octavian Augustus, Pompey. These people moved around their world in the same kind of sort of majesty. I mean, Caesar moved around the known world. It wasn't just that he was, the leader and sort of the ultimate warlord in his time. I'm not sure what else to call Caesar. We're going to talk about exactly what and who Julius Caesar was today. But the way that they would move from Spain over to Syria, I mean, in short periods of time, Caesar would do some amazing marches. That's one of the things that he's famous for. So let's get back to this one. And then the second part of it, the second part of the story is the children and the soap opera of it. It turns into, I think, a really interesting historic sort of novella at the end. And I wanted to go into that because I find that that's something that students are interested in, and I'm interested in it too. So let's go on then. So prior to Rome, so to Caesar, that is, so sort of looking at Rome, and then you have Roman conquest. You see it is sort of along that northern coast of the Mediterranean as we find it, coming into the time of Caesar, around, say, Caesar's born in 100 BCE, say the first half of the first century BCE. Looks something like this. Caesar born on July 12th, year 100 BCE, 100 years before the sort of Avatar year of Christ, to a noble Alban family. Remember, the Alban tribe was one of the two tribes, Alba Lydia, of the original Rome. So he comes from a good family. They are well connected. They're not one of the very top families, but Julius Caesar comes from a respectable Roman family. And he has political ambitions. And he has some adventures too. There's just so much information here, you can't put everything in it. Julius Caesar was a tough guy and very proud. He was at one time kidnapped by pirates. He refused to, he continued to act superior to the pirates. He told them he was going to have them crucified. They laughed. They thought that was a joke. They wanted 20 talents of gold for him. He insisted they asked for 50 because he was Caesar. And then when he was ransomed, then he put together his forces and went and hunted him down and crucified him. In the year 69, then at the age of 31, he was elected questor, which is kind of a prosecutor. And so Julius Caesar is this transition from the Roman Republic to imperial Rome. Julius Caesar is probably the most famous of these people, but he himself was not actually technically speaking, a Roman emperor. His designated heir and adopted son, Octavian, became Octavian Augustus, the first real Roman emperor, and that's part of the story. That's where the story that I'm telling today is going to end up. But Julius Caesar was what the ancient Greeks would have called a demagogue, a leader of the people. That is, you had the old Roman Republic, which, like imperial Athens, was nominally a democratic place because you had the Senate and you had all the members of the Senate, and they would discuss things and they would vote on things. And like the Athenians before them, so the Romans were proud of this, but they were a Senate of the upper class. The Roman Republic was an oligarchic place. It was a place run by traditional families. That was the idea of the place. And Julius Caesar was a populist leader. Julius Caesar then, originally, mention it now, when we see that he's a questor, a sort of prosecutor, and one of the ways he made his name with the people was by going after some particularly corrupt oligarchs and seeing to it that they were punished. And so in that way, he got public favor by sort of showing that these people kind of weren't above the law. Another political post, elective post that he occupied was one where he was in charge of sort of festivals and public services. And that was another thing that he used shrewdly to show the people that he was on their side against the elites, the optimates, led by Cicero and Cato and a number of others, the oligarchs of the Republican Senate. So this was a struggle that went on for many years. Hispania Ulterior, the very far reaches of the Iberian Peninsula, he went out there in 62. Julius Caesar, the thing is, as long as you were a military commander out in the provinces with your commission, you couldn't be prosecuted for crimes in Rome. In Rome, they would prosecute each other for all kinds of crimes. Politics was a very cutthroat business. And Julius Caesar, again, not one of the richest, not one of the most powerful, an ambitious politician, but he was a very, very good soldier. And he figured that out. And so he went out to the provinces away from the politics of Rome, where he could build up his own fortune and his own reputation. Caesar understood, as everybody understood in this world, that controlling provinces was also a really good way to make money. So he went out to the provinces, people in Rome not too unhappy to see him go out there. And his big rival in Rome was Pompey. And so in the year 53, they put together what was called the First Triumvirate. The First Triumvirate, more informal, but these three with Crassus. Crassus was the wealthiest man in Rome. Another thing that's going on here that's important when we get to Cleopatra is that everybody needs money. These politicians need wealthy allies and deep pockets to pay for things. And something that I think people miss about the whole story of Egypt and Rome is that Egypt was sort of the breadbasket of Rome, as they used to say. Egypt was a very, very rich producer of essential grains for Roman bread and all sorts of other things. So Egypt had lots of money and resources. So it wasn't just a matter of honor or something to have these alliances in politics with Egypt. If you had Egypt, you had money, you had food, and that made the leaders of Egypt also very influential, depending on where they threw their weight. So they put this triumvirate together. It's Pompey and Caesar and Crassus, the richest man in Rome. And they are informal. This is not a constitutional structure, but they are sort of more or less lording it over the Senate. And Caesar then, during the 50s, during that sixth decade of the first century before the Common Era, Caesar puts together a very, very large run of very great victories, which greatly expands the Roman Empire, and in doing so also assures Caesar's own place in history. But then, of course, he leverages that into greater power back in Rome. And here you see these, it's the Gallic Wars, we call them. He conquered Gaul. He got over to England. He goes back over there later. Also crossing the Rhine River, the German tribes are powerful the farther to the north and east you get. And he puts those tribes down as well. This is all area that Rome had not been able to exact any tribute from before. This is all open up conquered territory. So Caesar becomes extremely powerful, putting together this big military empire off to the west. And people in Rome sort of justifiably starting to become a little bit nervous about just how powerful Caesar with all of his legions is. Getting assigned legions and commands is something that's part of the political patronage system of Rome. But Caesar's building up his own armies into something, and his armies are fighting armies. Caesar's armies are out there in the field. His officers have experience. And so Julius Caesar then really is the one who sort of destroys the Roman Republic. It clears the way for the emperors, even though technically Caesar himself isn't really an emperor. Caesar's kind of unique. Caesar's kind of unique. I think maybe warlord, I'm not sure. Caesar and Marc Antony are maybe warlords, in a sense, in their time and place. So Pompey tells the Senate to order Caesar to come back to Rome. And the deal is, if you have a military command in the provinces, you cannot bring your army back to the Italian peninsula. And you, of course, when you're not in command of legions in the provinces, then, as I said, you're also subject to other political and legal actions in Rome. So Pompey wants Caesar to come back to Rome and sort of get back in the game with him, because Pompey wants to cut Caesar down in size a little bit. But Caesar's made of bolder stuff, and in the year 49, Caesar decides to cross the Rubicon, to cross the river, the Rubicon, which is the border. And when he crosses it with his army, he has then broken the law according to the Roman Senate, and has declared war. And this is indeed called Caesar's Civil War. And Caesar's army is formidable, and the senators and their military attaches chicken out and flee the city, and Julius Caesar occupies Rome, and he leaves his second in command, Marc Antony. Marc Antony, Julius Caesar's loyal lieutenant, who has fought alongside Julius Caesar for years and years. This is another thing that needs to be appreciated to fully appreciate the story of Julius Caesar, Marc Antony, and Cleopatra. Marc Antony came up with Julius Caesar, rode with Julius Caesar. He's a good bit younger than Julius Caesar, and he is his lieutenant and his trusted master of the horse, they called him. That was the name for the second in command of the legions. So Julius Caesar leaves. So Caesar leaves Marc Antony in command of Italy, and he goes off after Pompey. First, actually, he goes back out to the west, where some of Pompey's army has gone, and he defeats them. And then he turns around and chases Pompey out to the east, all the way out to the Greek peninsula, Peloponnesus, all the way out to where Sparta was. The two of them are out there with their armies, and he defeats Pompey there. Pompey manages to escape, and the Ptolemies are the ruling dynasty in Egypt. They've been aligned with Pompey. That is Ptolemy the 13th, who is the younger brother of Cleopatra. Cleopatra is actually losing a civil conflict, and her brother Ptolemy the 13th is sort of prosecuting a civil war against her at this time. In any event, Pompey shows up um, in Alexandria. Alexandria is the capital of Egypt, and he thinks that the Ptolemies will protect him from Caesar, but the Ptolemies are scared of Caesar. And so Ptolemy the 13th is actually at this point a adolescent boy. He's 12 years old or so, and he's actually say Ptolemy the 13th, but was these monks and other people who were around him, who the regime that was making the decisions, and they decided to kill Pompey on on the spot when he showed up in Alexandria. So here we see, and this is again getting that the first thing I wanted to talk about, which was the incredible movements of these Roman leaders of Caesar and Antony and Octavian. You see here, and remember we're counting down, and so in the solid lines is various campaigns out to the west. But the dotted lines, after he crosses the Rubicon, you see there in 49, and then he's chasing Pompey. He's chasing Pompey out to the Greek peninsula and eventually down to Alexandria in Egypt. So this is the life of these people. This is how they roll. They move all over. Okay. So Caesar and Cleopatra. And from this long distance, in retrospect, and knowing that Cleopatra was always this sort of exotic Egyptian who never was certainly not the empress of the Roman Empire. If Cleopatra had been the empress of the Roman Empire, as she well might have been, we wouldn't remember her as an exotic Oriental Egyptian swarthy person with all that sort of Orientalizing baggage, a lot of which had to do with Roman propaganda, Octavian and Augustan propaganda. But no, Cleopatra was a very refined Ptolemaic Greek-speaking person who Caesar wanted as his queen. And if she had done that and outlived Caesar, she would have become the empress of Rome, and she would have been someone who spoke her native language was actually Greek, someone who spoke fluent Roman, and we wouldn't really remember her as this Egyptian creature. But that's not how things went down. But they almost went down that way, and that's the important thing to appreciate. When Caesar and Cleopatra had a child together, their son was certainly, Cleopatra was the queen of Egypt, and Caesar was Julius Caesar, eventually dictator of all of Rome. And the assumption certainly was that their son was going to be the ruler of the known world. I mean, again, that's not how things worked out. But from the point of view of people on the scene at the time, that certainly would have been just the working assumption, which also helps make a lot more sense of the sort of bloody history we have here. So Caesar arrives in Egypt. He's chasing Pompey. Pompey goes down to Alexandria, is immediately killed. Caesar arrives in Alexandria, hot on the trail of Pompey, and he finds himself in the middle of a power struggle between Cleopatra and the regime of her, nominally the regime of her younger brother, Pompey the 13th, who is also her ceremonial husband. I mean, it's not, they weren't really, but, and they are, and Cleopatra's losing. Cleopatra's sort of in hiding and besieged, that is. Caesar finds himself in the middle of a siege of Cleopatra by Ptolemy's forces. And Caesar isn't too happy with the Ptolemaic faction because they were the ones who were sort of siding with Pompey. But then not only that, but Caesar also felt it was an offense that they had presumed to murder Pompey, who was, after all, a member of the triumvirate of Rome. And they presented Caesar with Pompey's head in a bag when Caesar arrived. Caesar reportedly actually shed tears at that point and went on later on, after he and Cleopatra regained power in Egypt. He goes on to find and kill all the people who were involved in assassinating Pompey. Cleopatra is 21 years old. She has to get around the regime's security at the palace to get in to talk to Caesar, who wants to talk to her, because again, he wants to see if he can make a deal with her rather than deal with the Ptolemaic faction that he doesn't like. And she comes in wrapped in a carpet. Apparently, this is true. She's wrapped up in something, and probably something like a carpet. Cleopatra liked grand entrances. We'll see another grand entrance of hers later. And Caesar is indeed charmed by Cleopatra. Caesar in his 50s at this time. And he takes Cleopatra aside, as he was going to do. Ptolemy, her brother, is killed. He actually drowned. Ptolemy drowns in a river while they're having their fight. And with Caesar and Roman backing, Cleopatra becomes then the queen of Egypt. And in the following year, in 47, she and Caesar have a son, Caesarion. It's not clear whether Caesarian sections are named after Caesarion or Caesarion is named after Caesarian sections, which is an interesting question. But it's one of the two. So this is what I was talking about before in terms of our perspective and how we have a sort of retrospective of things and maybe don't quite appreciate what things were like from the perspective of someone who was on the ground at the time. Caesar means business with Cleopatra. He brings her and their son back to Rome in 46. And not only that, but he does it with a great deal of pageantry. He brings the Queen of Egypt back as his consort to live in his villa. He also has another wife. They have a funny system. It's basically monogamous. They have divorce. Most of these people have multiple spouses, both the upper class men and the women. These are various kinds of political marriages between gens or houses. They're arranged. And all of these people that we're talking about, including the people who are mortal enemies of each other, when you go into the details, which obviously I can only skim in this format, they all are related by marriage, political marriages. They're all cousins all over the place. All of these people, this very, very high upper class of the society is a small world. So there they are back in Rome. He's back in Rome with Cleopatra, his consort, and he in fact erects a gilded statue of her in the Temple Venus Genetrix down by the forum where the Vestal Virgins are, which is a controversial thing to do, indeed, and some people are offended by that. There are factions. Rome is a fractured place. You've got Republican sympathizers, and you've got populist sympathizers, and you've got people who like Cleopatra, and you've got people who don't like Cleopatra. Cleopatra's in Rome for a couple of years. There are Roman ladies who actually sort of adopted the Cleopatra look and start wearing their hair like Cleopatra, which later becomes a problem because archaeologists can't tell which statues are actually statues of Cleopatra and which statues are statues of Roman ladies who were enjoying the fad of the Cleopatra look. So there are people who like Cleopatra, there are people who don't. Cleopatra takes herself very seriously. And among other things, you've heard, of course, of all the Roman viaducts. Romans were good at hydraulics and they moved a lot of water around, had canals. Well, actually, a lot of that is technology that came from Egypt. And one of the policy wonks who was interested in building viaducts and moving water around was Cleopatra, who actually had a hand in some of these meetings and some of these plans. And again, some people in Rome thought it was fine that Cleopatra was Caesar's consort and was there in Rome, and other people not so much. But things did not work out like the two of them thought. They were there with their son Caesarion. And so for a while there, for a lot of people, the future looked clear, which was that Caesar and Cleopatra would be the rulers. and that eventually, in the fullness of time, Caesarion would be the ruler of Rome. You know, but that's not what happened. Caesar declares himself dictator in January of 44, and this is too much for his enemies. And he is mobbed at the Senate, led by one of his old allies, Brutus. He's scared everyone now, and they all surround him and stab him. That way, no single person has the responsibility of having done it. And since they're all members of the Senate, there's nothing anyone can do about it. And nobody does. But after this assassination of Caesar on March 15th in the year 44, Cleopatra obviously has to flee back to Alexandria, which is exactly what she does. Here's a big Hollywood production from, I believe it's 1964, starring Elizabeth Taylor as Cleopatra. She's coming to Rome with Caesarion. Of course, Caesarion was actually only 1 year old at the time, but in the movie they make him into a little kid, seeing the and this there was this kind of level of pageantry, and they also definitely played up the Egyptian thing. Another part of the politics with Cleopatra is she was a Ptolemaic Greek. The Ptolemies were Macedonian Greeks. Their progenitor was one of Alexander's generals during the Alexandrian conquests at the end of the 4th century. And so she's descended from that 200 plus year dynasty of Greeks, of Macedonian Greeks, who took over when Alexander took over. Their capital is Alexandria. But Cleopatra is actually, surprisingly, I would say, the first person in this very long line of Ptolemaic rulers of Egypt who decides to be an Egyptian nationalist. Right now, at the time of when coming into all of these events happening, Egypt is a client state of Rome. They have a certain degree of autonomy. They have trading agreements with Rome. At the end of all of this, Augustus makes them a province. All right, but what I wanted to say, I'm sorry, was that then Cleopatra, though she means to take Egypt independent, she wants to take Egypt away from altogether from its tributary relationship with Rome, and she tries to revive the old pharaonic. The old pharaonic stuff from Egypt had gone, by the way, at this point for 1,000 years. The last dynasty of the old pharaohs is over at the time of the Bronze Age collapse, the end of the 2nd millennium. So reviving the notion of the pharaoh and some of the other trappings of and religious, for example, dogmas of the old pharaonic dynasties was a self-conscious bit of self-engineering on the part of Cleopatra, who wanted to revive Egyptian nationalism in order to take Egypt independent from Rome, which again was her grand plan. After she realized that she wasn't going to be the queen of Rome, although she never entirely gave that up. Cleopatra was an endlessly ambitious person. So Cleopatra has now gone to Rome with Julius Caesar, had Julius Caesar's son Caesarion. But Julius Caesar has been assassinated, and Cleopatra has now retreated back to Alexandria. But that's not the end of the story. Remember, Marc Antony is Julius Caesar's right-hand man. Now, Julius Caesar's gone. But Marc Antony has been at the side of Julius Caesar, fighting side by side as his main lieutenant, his second in command for many, many years. And Marc Antony then, of course, is also Julius Caesar's designated successor. So you get in 43 a second triumvirate. Now this time it's Marc Antony and Octavian. And who is Octavian? Octavian is actually the grandnephew of Julius Caesar, but Octavian is Julius Caesar's adopted son and designated heir at this time. So that's the issue. I mean, Octavian also has ambitions, and Octavian is at the sort of center of power in Rome. So they form another triumvirate with Lepidus, who lasts for a while, but Lepidus eventually is sidelined by the other two who split the Roman Empire between them. Back in Egypt at this time, again coming into the late 40s, 43, 42, 41, Cleopatra siding with the triumvirate. Of course, she has to make her loyalties known as far as Roman politics are concerned. She, of course, has this long history. By the way, when Cleopatra was, I think, 11 to 15, when she was a girl, she also lived for 4 years in Rome with her father, who was exiled from Egypt at that time before they went back. So when Cleopatra goes to Rome with Julius Caesar, it's not the first time she's going. She knows Rome well. She's lived in Rome before. So, so in any event, Octavian and Antony in 42 basically split the empire. Antony to the east, Octavian to the west. And Antony is out to the east, and he is with Cleopatra sometimes. He meets Cleopatra in 41. Cleopatra, of course, who is Antony? Well, a very important person. Antony also is a little bit nuts. Antony doesn't have the self-discipline of Julius Caesar. Antony is a wilder sort of person, a more impetuous man, and he has a serious personality clash with Octavian, who is a very sort of small c conservative kind of person who really likes to have things in order, and Antony is not that kind of person at all. Antony thinks he's a god. Another thing here that is hard for us to understand. These people would call themselves gods, name themselves gods, align themselves gods, and we can see that as sort of, art politique, right, as sort of political propaganda and so on. But at some level, they seem to really think, that they were descended from gods. I'm not exactly sure what it means to say they think that they were descended from gods. I don't know literally what that is saying that they believed, but that was an issue, so that when they made certain religious proclamations, these were politically very significant in a way, again, it's difficult for us to understand. So Antony tends to think he's a god of himself as a god. He's into that. And Cleopatra knows this. Cleopatra shows up on a golden barge with purple sails. I really like the sound of those purple sails. Remember, purple is royal color. And silver oars, and she's dressed up like Aphrodite. And Antony loves it. Antony loves it. He doesn't know Cleopatra from before, but he likes her. And they spend the year 41, 40 in Alexandria. There's a lot of stories about them when they were in Alexandria. Apparently, Cleopatra and Marc Antony used to like to disguise themselves as ordinary people and go out in the streets of Alexandria. It's a fairly big city, and just sort of go out and about and have adventures and go to little bars and run around Alexandria incognito. So, and in 40, their twins are born, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene. Helios and Selene, the sun and the moon. Again, their mother has tremendous ambitions for these people. Remember, she still also has Caesarion, their half-brother, who is Julius Caesar's son, and she still thinks that gives him a legitimate claim to be a ruler in Rome as well, as so do a lot of other people. It's a little bit complicated because, again, Octavian and Antony aren't getting along. And so in 40, Antony agrees to a political marriage with Octavia, Octavian's older sister. And remember, he's already got, so in the year 1940, so here's the thing, here's the novella part, right? In the year, oy, Dios mío. In the year 1940, Antony has twins with Cleopatra, Alexander and Selene, Cleopatra Selene. In the year 1939, he has a daughter with his wife, Octavia. And in the year 1936, he has another daughter with his wife, Octavia. But in the year 1936, he also has another son, Ptolemy Philadelphus, with Cleopatra. That is it's in 1936. In the year 36 BCE, then Mark Antony has he has a daughter by Octavia, the sister of Octavian, the other triumvirate, who rules the other half of the empire. And that same year, Antony also has a son by Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt. So Antony, as I say, he's a little bit active. And it's from this time, really, after Cleopatra had been in Rome with Julius Caesar, had gone back to Alexandria, and now had this alliance with Mark Antony, that Octavian really cranks up a lot of propaganda about how she is this exotic, as I was saying before, sort of oriental, sexual kind of creature. And this is all just hooey. Her native language is Greek. I say she speaks many. It's actually an interesting question how many languages Cleopatra spoke. She spoke Greek, she spoke Latin, she spoke Egyptian. She learned Egyptian, unlike most upper class Ptolemies, because she wanted to be a legitimate popular leader of Egypt. Also spoke Aramaic, and apparently, or by legend or writings of historians, spoke a number of other languages as well. She was interested in astronomy and mathematics, which are really big in Egypt, and she knew a lot of other things as well. Remember, running Egypt isn't nothing. Egypt is a huge economic powerhouse and a huge producer of grains for export, wheat and rice and other things. So Cleopatra, and also, by the way, people didn't think Cleopatra was physically, conventionally incredibly good looking. Again, unlike the Octavian propaganda, people said she was very charismatic to talk to. So the real Cleopatra, I think, was probably actually a lot more impressive than this kind of vampy Elizabeth, what's her name, Elizabeth Taylor Cleopatra image, which, as I say, was consciously built up by. It's like what they did to Hillary Clinton, right? I mean, they did that to Cleopatra too. They were scared of her. She was ambitious and smart, and they spent a really lot of money convincing everybody that she was some kind of she-devil. And then that's really a big part of how we see Cleopatra today. We didn't necessarily have to see her the way that we do. Here's you see the Mark Antony and Octavian sharing power, coins being issued, Roman coins, with the heads of the two triumvirs, as they're called. So this is going on all through the 30s, all through the fourth decade. Antony is spending a lot of time, part of the time he's with Octavia, Octavian's sister. They're having their kids. Part of the other time, whenever he's with Cleopatra, they're having kids. And Octavian is not amused. And Octavian also has had enough of Cleopatra's independentista routine with all the pharaonic stuff and everything. Octavian's just not buying it. So he says he gets a declaration of war out of the Senate. Mark Antony quickly says, well, if that's the way it's going to be, that's the way it's going to be, and he'll fight with Cleopatra, and they'll take Octavian out. And 40% of the Roman Senate, including both of the councils, the two councils are the highest elected officials every year, and all go with Mark Antony. It's not obvious that Octavian's going to be able to have his way with Mark Antony, the triumvirate of the East, and Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt, by any means. But he does. They finally have a naval battle right up close off the coast of Greece, right off the Actian Peninsula of Greece, Western Greece. They have a naval battle, Octavian's Roman fleet against Antony's Roman fleet, with Cleopatra on board on her ship with a number of her own Egyptian fleet accompanying Marc Antony in the fight against Octavian's ships. Cleopatra's out there in her ship, and they lose. They retreat back to Egypt. Marc Antony is captured and falls on his sword and commits suicide. Cleopatra is about to be captured soon after that and commits suicide, reportedly by getting bitten by an asp, a poison snake, which is a sacred Egyptian figure, perhaps, but in any event, she probably poisoned herself. Octavian now declares himself in the year 27, the Emperor Augustus. So Octavian now becomes the first true Roman emperor. Again, it was Julius Caesar who destroyed the Roman Republic with his warlordism, but it is he and Antony's, it is his heir, Octavian, Antony's rival, who ultimately defeats Antony. Octavian, who declares himself Octavian Augustus, the first Roman emperor. And he continues to be the Roman emperor until the year 14 of the Common Era. Well, here's the Battle of Actium. You can see, I don't know, I guess. I think the interesting thing about that is how far away it is from both Rome and Alexandria, where they're fighting. Well, so let's follow through on the novella then, just to round this out. Okay. Remember Octavian's older sister, Octavia, and it's 30, and Antony and Cleopatra have committed suicide, and Octavian is in a celebrating mood. He's just, among other things, conquered Egypt once and for all. But you know, he brings the twins, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, as well as their younger brother, Ptolemy, back to Rome, and he loads them down, the twins, they're 10 years old, and he loads them down with gold chains that are so heavy that they can't stand up, and he has them on a float, and he parades them through the streets of Rome. And this creates a backlash. It sounds kind of barbaric, and a lot of people in Rome thought it looked kind of barbaric too, and that was a mistake for Octavian politically. Why do such a thing? Because he has to show that these people, these 10-year-old twins, are not going to be the rulers of Rome, as many other people still think maybe they are. It seems as if that's their fate. And he has to make sure people understand that it's not. But he turns out to have a little bit of domestic political backlash from this. So he sends him to his sister Octavia's house. Remember Octavia, who had the political marriage to Antony, political marriage, and 2 daughters, Antonia, they called them Antonia the elder and Antonia the younger. Octavia also has 2 sons from a previous marriage. And one of those boys is ultimately killed by Octavia, as well as possibly Alexander Helios. We don't actually know what happened to Alexander Helios or Ptolemy Philadelphus. Because we don't have any records of Alexander Helios after he was taken back to Rome with his sister and his younger brother, most people assume he probably didn't live much longer, although we don't actually know that. And something that's interesting is in the case of the baby, Philadelphus, Ptolemy Philadelphus, it looks like Octavia probably found probably a respectable upper-class Roman household that would take the baby under an assumed name so the baby would be safe. There's some reason to think that child of Antony and Cleopatra just went on to have a life and maybe to have children of their own, but we don't know what happened to them. We think that Alexander Helios, most people, I wouldn't know, but most people think that Alexander Helios probably passed away fairly early. But the situation for Cleopatra Selene was different. And she grew up with her aunt, or whatever she called her, Octavia. Remember, she's no blood relation to Octavia. She's Octavia's dead husband's lover's daughter. But Octavia raises her. And King Juba II from North Africa, he's a Berber tribesman. That's an Arab tribe from the desert. They're still around. Out where Morocco and Algeria are. It's a royal family out there. And the son, Juba II, was out campaigning with Octavian and fought well and brought his soldiers along and did a good job. And Octavian wanted to reward him. So they made that part of North Africa, became a Roman province. And Octavian actually said, okay, Cleopatra Selene then, Cleopatra and Antony's daughter, Octavian blessed her marriage to King Juba III to cement the whole thing. He wanted to reward King Juba the second, rather, I'm sorry, the young man. And I think it's interesting that he would think that one way to show how much he appreciated the young man's services would be to give him the hand of Cleopatra Selene, who obviously at that point he didn't see as a threat at all, but rather he thought that marrying her into that family was a good political move. And they did a good job, the two of them. They're well known. They did a good job developing their province. They became very, very wealthy. And she had 2 children and herself. And those children went back into Roman society. And in fact, this is a famous household of people who are prominent in upper class Roman society for generations thereafter. So they made it. And you can actually go to the tomb of Juba II and Cleopatra Selene next time you're in Tipasa on the Mediterranean coast of Algeria. You might want to stop by and check it out because they're there. So a little blast of 1st century BCE Roman politics, because there's really nothing like it. I mean, and the thing that I really like about the story is that it's true. It really happened. These people are real. We know all about them. This is all very well documented stuff. You saw a lot of specific days of the week in there. We know about it down to that detail. And in fact, I mentioned at the beginning of this that I had somewhat of a hard time conceiving and putting together this whole thing because there's so much information. And, I knew what I wanted to emphasize, but there's just so much information here. It's a fascinating story. And it has been dramatized in really some great ways, including some great made-for-TV things. And it will continue to be so, but in any event. Julius Caesar, Marc Antony, Cleopatra, and Octavian Augustus, and his sister Octavia. Amazing cast of people. All righty then. So that's so much for this one. And bye-bye.